Welcome back to Coin Explorer Vault, and today, I want you to take a very close look at a little piece of American history that could have passed through your hands without you ever giving it a second thought: the 1973 Roosevelt dime. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary 10-cent coin, the kind you might have dropped into a coffee shop tip jar, carried in a coat pocket, or tossed into a glass jar on a kitchen shelf decades ago. But there is a number connected to this coin that can make even an experienced collector stop and ask questions. $54 million. Now, before you reach for your old coin jar, there is something important we need to understand. That $54 million figure is a claimed or hypothetical value, not a verified sale price for an ordinary 1973 Roosevelt dime. And that distinction matters. So why has this particular date attracted attention? And what could make one example dramatically more interesting than another? That is where our story begins. The 1973 Roosevelt dime was struck at the Denver Mint, and the tiny D mint mark above the date is one of the first things you should look for. According to PCGS, approximately 455,032,426 examples were struck at Denver that year, which means this was not a coin that was rare simply because of its mintage. And yet, that does not mean every surviving example is equal. In coin collecting, the difference between an ordinary circulated coin and an exceptional specimen can sometimes be astonishing. Think back to the 1970s for a moment. Maybe you remember walking into an old neighborhood store, hearing the bell over the door, buying something small with coins from your pocket, and receiving a handful of change in return. A dime was only 10 cents, and nobody imagined that one of those little coins might someday become a treasured collectible. The Roosevelt dime itself had already been part of American life for generations by 1973. The design honored President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose portrait appears on the obverse, while the reverse carries the torch, olive branch, and oak branch symbols that give this tiny coin a surprisingly powerful character. The 1973 D is made from copper nickel clad over a copper center, weighs about 2.27 grams, measures 17.9 millimeters across, and has a reeded edge. But the date catches your attention, and the D mint mark tells you where it was made. The real question is what condition that coin survived in. Imagine someone opening an old drawer today and discovering a 1973 D dime that has somehow escaped decades of heavy circulation. Maybe it came from a forgotten collection. Maybe a parent or grandparent placed it into an envelope years ago and simply forgot about it. Maybe it sat untouched in a coin jar while thousands of other coins came and went. That is the kind of discovery that makes collectors lean closer. Because when a coin survives with sharp details, original surfaces, minimal contact marks, and strong overall eye appeal, its story changes. This is where condition becomes one of the most important clues. A worn dime that has spent years in circulation is generally not going to command the kind of money associated with a spectacularly preserved specimen. But a high-grade example can be considerably more desirable. PCGS records an auction result of $1,200 for a 1973 D Roosevelt dime, graded MS-65, sold by Stax Bowers on June 26, 2024. That real-world figure is a much better guide than simply repeating a sensational internet claim. And this is where the mystery gets even more interesting, because the most valuable part of your dime may not be the date alone. It could be the combination of date, mint mark, condition, strike, and possible variety. Collectors often pay particular attention to the reverse bands of Roosevelt dimes. A designation such as full bands, sometimes abbreviated FB, can indicate unusually complete separation in the horizontal bands around the torch. PCGS lists a separate 1973 D full bands variety, showing that collectors do distinguish particularly well-struck examples from ordinary strikes. So if you have a 1973 D dime in front of you, do not simply glance at the portrait and put it away. Place it under good light. Look at the date. Find the D above the date. Then turn the coin over and study the torch. Are the horizontal bands sharply separated? Do the letters look crisp? Are the leaves and branches clearly defined? Is the rim intact? Are there obvious scratches, heavy contact marks, discoloration, or signs of cleaning? A magnifying glass can help, but remember, you are inspecting the coin, not trying to polish it. Never clean a potentially collectible coin just because it looks dirty. Cleaning can damage the original surface and may reduce collector interest. And here is another clue that many people overlook: the edge. Because the 1973D dime is copper-nickel clad over a copper center, the reeded edge can provide useful information when examining the coin. You are looking for anything unusual, but unusual does not automatically mean valuable. A strange-looking coin could have suffered damage after leaving the mint, and post-mint damage is very different from a genuine mint-made error. That distinction is critical. We should never call a coin a rare error simply because the lettering looks odd or the surface has a strange mark. A genuine error generally needs careful examination and, for serious claims, professional authentication. This is why the idea of a $54 million 1973D dime should be approached with curiosity, not certainty. There is no verified evidence in the sources we checked showing an ordinary 1973D Roosevelt dime selling for $54 million. In fact, published PCGS pricing information for the 1973D shows values far below that figure for the listed grades, with exceptional pieces commanding more than ordinary examples, but nowhere near tens of millions. And that may actually make your search more exciting, because now you know what separates a real numismatic discovery from an exaggerated claim. You are not simply hunting for a magical 10-cent coin worth a fortune. You are searching for the unusual example, the coin with something genuinely different about it, whether that is extraordinary preservation, a recognized variety, a significant mint error confirmed by specialists, or an exceptionally strong strike. Think about the number of 1973D dimes that have disappeared into drawers, jars, boxes, old purses, and family collections. More than 500 million were not struck at Denver, as the actual mintage was about 455 million. But that is still a tremendous number of coins entering everyday American commerce. Most were meant to be spent, not saved. That is what gives the survivors their human story. One may have been carried by a young father buying groceries. Another may have been slipped into a child's hand for a trip to the corner store. Another may have sat untouched inside a collection for 50 years. And when you hold one today, you are holding a coin that passed through an America that no longer looks quite the same. That is the emotional side of collecting that price guides cannot measure. But there is still one question hanging over our 1973D dime. What should you do if yours really does look different? First, do not clean it. Second, photograph both sides in good natural light. Third, weigh it with a reasonably accurate digital scale and compare the result with the standard specifications. Fourth, examine the date and the D-mint mark carefully. Fifth, inspect the torch and bands on the reverse. And finally, if you believe you have a genuine mint error or an exceptionally rare variety, consider having it examined by a reputable professional grading or authentication service. Remember, a coin story becomes much more powerful when the evidence supports it. So the next time an old dime falls out of a drawer, or you hear the familiar clink of coins inside a jar that has been sitting untouched for years, pause before you spend it. Turn it over. Check the date. Check the mint mark. Study the condition. And ask yourself one simple question: what happened to this little piece of metal during the 50-plus years it has been alive? Because sometimes the most fascinating discoveries are not hiding in a treasure chest. They are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to look. And if the 1973D has taught us anything, it is that the difference between an ordinary dime and a remarkable collectible can begin with something as small as a letter above a date. But our search does not end here, because waiting in the next chapter is another Roosevelt dime from an earlier moment in American history, the 1970D Roosevelt dime. And its date opens another intriguing door into the world of overlooked pocket change. What might make that older dime worth a second look? That is the question we will follow next. Next, let's turn our attention to the 1970D Roosevelt dime, a coin that may look completely ordinary until you realize how many clues can be hidden in 10 cents. The year is 1970, the mint mark is a small d, and somewhere in the world today, examples of this coin are still sitting quietly in old collections, forgotten drawers, coin jars, and inherited boxes. But there is a figure connected with this coin that immediately raises eyebrows: $58 million. Before that number sends you running for your old change. However, remember that this is a claimed or hypothetical value, not a verified market price for an ordinary 1970D Roosevelt dime. The real mystery is much more interesting. If millions of these coins were made, what could possibly make one particular example stand apart from the rest? The answer may be hiding in a place most people never think to inspect. The 1970 D Roosevelt dime was struck at the Denver Mint, and that tiny D mint mark is one of the first clues your eyes should find. According to PCGS, Denver struck approximately 128,145,000 Roosevelt dimes dated 1970. PCGS.com. https://www.pcgs.com/coin/1970D10C/5135. source equals checkbit.com. That is a substantial number, and it immediately tells us something important. The date alone does not make every 1970 D dime rare. Yet rarity in numismatics is rarely as simple as counting how many coins were originally struck. What matters is how many survived in exceptional condition, how many possessed desirable characteristics, and whether any examples contain genuine varieties or mint-made errors. Now picture America in 1970. The country was changing rapidly, but ordinary life still revolved around familiar things: neighborhood stores, family cars, paper envelopes, cash registers, and coins carried in pockets. A dime was still a dime. You could spend one without hesitation. Perhaps someone watching today remembers receiving a handful of change after buying something at a small shop, then tossing the coins into a drawer when they returned home. Maybe one of those coins stayed there for decades. That is the kind of forgotten journey that makes old coins so fascinating. The 1970 D Roosevelt dime carries the familiar portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt on the obverse, while the reverse displays the torch surrounded by an olive branch and an oak branch. Its composition is copper-nickel clad over a copper core, and its standard weight is about 2.27 grams. PCGS.com. https://www.pcgs.com/coin/1970D10C/5135. source equals checkbit.com. But the moment you put a magnifying glass over that little coin, the story becomes much more complicated. The date is only the beginning. Start with the obverse. Look carefully at Roosevelt's portrait. Examine the lettering. Check the rim. Look for unusual doubling, misplaced design elements, or other characteristics that appear to have originated during the minting process rather than from years of circulation. Then move to the reverse. Study the torch. Look at the horizontal bands and surrounding details. A strong strike can make a major difference in how collectors view a Roosevelt dime, particularly when the coin has remained bright and well-preserved. But this is where patience becomes more valuable than excitement. A scratch is not automatically an error. A flattened letter is not automatically a rare variety. A strange-looking rim can simply be the result of damage after the coin entered circulation. And a coin that appears unusually shiny may have been cleaned, something collectors generally do not want to see on a potentially valuable piece. So if you discover a 1970 D dime in an old collection, resist the temptation to improve its appearance. Do not polish it. Do not scrub it. Do not put chemicals on it. Preserve the surface exactly as you found it. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because the value of a 1970 D can change dramatically depending on condition. A heavily circulated example with scratches, and whereas a completely different collectible from a coin that has survived with sharp details, attractive surfaces, and very little evidence of contact. PCGS lists auction information for high-grade 1970 D Roosevelt dimes, including a recorded MS-67 example that sold for $456 at auction in 2022. PCGS.com. https://www.pcgs.com/coin/1970D10C/5135. source equals checkbit.com. That real-world result helps put the sensational $58 million claim into perspective. There is a tremendous gap between an actual documented auction result and an extraordinary figure circulating online. And that gap is precisely why careful collectors learn to separate documented value from claimed value. But don't let that discourage you. In fact, it should make your search smarter. If you have one of these dimes, you now know that the important question is not simply, Is this a 1970D? The better question is, what is different about this 1970D? Maybe it is unusually well preserved. Maybe the strike is exceptional. Maybe there is a genuine variety. Maybe there is a legitimate mint error that deserves professional examination. Or perhaps it is simply a beautiful survivor of an era that has almost completely disappeared. Every one of those possibilities tells a different story. Think about an old family collection. There may be no handwritten certificate, no professional grading label, and no record of where the coins came from. Just a small envelope with a date written in pencil, perhaps stored in a dresser for half a century. You might open that envelope and find several Roosevelt dimes, each one looking almost identical. Yet under magnification, one could reveal noticeably sharper details than the others. That difference is where a collector's eye begins to develop. You start comparing surfaces. You start studying the fields around the portrait. You start looking for contact marks in the most exposed areas. You begin to understand why professional grading exists. A coin's value is not determined by age alone. Rarity, grade, demand, eye appeal, and authenticity all matter. And if someone claims a particular 1970D Roosevelt dime is worth tens of millions, the first question should always be, what is the evidence? Is there a documented auction? Is there a recognized error? Has the coin been authenticated? Is the grade independently certified? Without those answers, the number remains a claim rather than established market value. That is especially important when you are looking through your own pocket change. You do not want to throw away an interesting coin because someone told you every 1970D is worthless, but you also do not want to believe every sensational internet headline. The truth is usually found in the details. So take your time. If you have a 1970D dime, place it on a clean, soft surface. Use good lighting. Look at the date and the D mint mark. Turn it over slowly. Study the torch and bands. Examine the lettering and rim. Check the edge. If the coin looks unusual, photograph it before doing anything else. If its weight or appearance seems significantly different from normal specifications, that may justify further investigation. And if you believe you have a genuine mint-made error or exceptional variety, professional authentication is the safest next step. Remember, collectors are not simply buying metal. They are buying a documented story. They want to know where a coin came from, what makes it unusual, and whether its special characteristics can be proven. That is why a humble dime can become so fascinating. It connects ordinary people to the machinery of the United States Mint, to decades of American commerce, and to the quiet habit of saving something that seemed insignificant at the time. Somewhere, perhaps, an older collector still has a jar filled with coins from the 1960s and 1970s. Somewhere, a family box contains change that has not been examined since a grandparent put it away. Somewhere, a 1970D Roosevelt dime may be sitting among dozens of ordinary coins, waiting for someone to notice a detail that others missed. And when you think about it, that is the real magic of coin collecting. You are not just searching for a fortune, you are searching for a discovery. You are asking questions that the coin cannot answer by itself. Who carried it? Where did it travel? Why was it saved? What happened to it after it left the Denver Mint? And why did it survive when so many others disappeared into circulation? But there is another Roosevelt dime waiting in our journey, and this one takes us even farther back into the 1960s. The 1967 Roosevelt dime carries its own fascinating story, and its date belongs to a period when America's coinage was facing extraordinary changes. So before you put that old 1970D away, remember the clues you've learned today: date, mint mark, condition, strike, and authenticity. Because the next coin may show us why the 1960s produced some of the most interesting Roosevelt dimes for collectors, and one particular year is about to become our next mystery. Next, let's turn our attention to the 1967 Roosevelt dime. And this time, the date takes us into one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of American coinage. A tiny 10-cent piece from 1967 can look almost ordinary in your hand. Yet there is a figure sometimes attached to this coin that sounds almost impossible: $63 million. But before that number captures your imagination, there is an important truth every serious collector should know. $63 million is a claimed or hypothetical figure, not a verified sale price for an ordinary 1967 Roosevelt dime. The real story is far more intriguing, because 1967 was not an ordinary year for American coins. It was a period when the mint was struggling with enormous demand, changing metal costs, and a shortage of circulating coins. And if you happen to have a 1967 Roosevelt dime tucked away in an old collection, there are several clues worth examining before you decide whether it is simply pocket change or something much more interesting. Imagine America in the middle of the 1960s. The country was moving through enormous changes, and even something as familiar as the coins in your pocket was being affected. Silver prices had risen, and the United States Mint had already begun replacing the traditional silver composition of dimes and quarters with copper-nickel-clad coinage. The 1967 Roosevelt dime belongs to that transitional era, and that alone gives it an important historical character. The dime is dated 1967, but there is something unusual about the minting story. There is no mint mark on standard 1967 Roosevelt dimes because the United States Mint suspended mint marks during the coin shortage. That means you should not expect to find a D, S, or P beside the date on a normal 1967 dime. This is one of the first clues that separates this coin from the 1970D and 1973D examples we have already examined. The absence of a mint mark is not automatically an error for a normal 1967 dime. It is exactly what you should expect. And that little detail is important because it shows why collectors must understand history before deciding that something unusual is automatically rare. According to PCGS, the Philadelphia Mint produced approximately 602,662,722 Roosevelt dimes dated 1967, while the San Francisco Mint produced approximately 56,924,950. PCGS.com. https://www.pcgs.com/coin/1967110c/5105. UTA_source equals checkit.com. Those numbers tell us immediately that the 1967 dime was produced in very large quantities. So why would collectors care about it? Because mintage is only one part of the story. Survival, condition, strike, varieties, and errors can completely change how collectors view an individual coin. And this is where your old coin jar becomes interesting. Think back to the jars many families kept on a shelf or in a kitchen cabinet. You might remember dropping coins into one after returning home from the store, perhaps without even looking at the dates. Over the years, those jars became little time capsules. A 1967 dime could have been sitting there for decades, untouched, while other coins came and went. Maybe it belonged to your parents. Maybe a grandparent saved it because it was from an interesting year. Maybe it was simply forgotten. Now imagine finding one today and noticing that the surfaces are remarkably clean, the details are sharp, and the coin has very little evidence of circulation. Suddenly, you are looking at it differently. You are no longer asking whether a 1967 dime is old. You are asking whether this particular example survived in an unusually high grade. That distinction is crucial. A circulated 1967 dime can show where across Roosevelt's hair, cheek, and the high points of the reverse design. The fields may contain scratches and contact marks from years of handling. But a high-grade coin can retain much sharper detail and more attractive surfaces. PCGS records auction information for 1967 Roosevelt dimes, including a high-grade MS-67 example that brought $1,528 at auction in 2021. PCGS.com. https://www.pcgs.com/coin/1967110c/5105. UTA_source equals checkit.com. That documented result is dramatically different from the sensational $63 million claim, and it gives us a much more realistic picture of what exceptional certified examples can actually bring. But don't stop there, because the history of 1967 creates another fascinating possibility. This was the era of the silver transition, and that means collectors sometimes pay close attention to composition, weight, and possible transitional or wrong planchet errors. However, this is precisely where caution matters. You should never assume that an unusual weight proves a rare error. A damaged coin, altered coin, or inaccurate scale can create misleading results. If your 1967 dime appears significantly different from standard specifications, That is when professional examination becomes worthwhile. Look carefully at the edge. Look at the surfaces. Check the weight with a reliable scale. Compare the coin with a known standard example. And never clean it. A collector might forgive a little dirt, but they cannot undo damage caused by polishing or harsh chemicals. Now turn the coin over. The reverse features the familiar torch, olive branch, and oak branch. Under magnification, inspect the lettering and the design elements. Look at the torch bands carefully. Strongly defined bands can make an exceptionally well-struck Roosevelt dime more desirable. But again, a strong strike is not the same thing as a rare error. This distinction may sound technical, but it is one of the most important lessons in coin collecting. Unusual does not always mean rare, and rare does not automatically mean millions of dollars. A genuine collectible discovery requires evidence. That evidence might come from a recognized variety, a documented mint error, exceptional certified condition, or another characteristic that specialists can verify. The $63 million figure attached to this coin should therefore be treated as a claim rather than established market value. And honestly, that makes the hunt more enjoyable. You do not have to believe every unbelievable number to appreciate what is in your hands. You simply need to know what to look for. The 1967 dime is particularly interesting because it came from a year when the American coinage system itself was under pressure. Millions of coins were needed, silver was becoming more expensive, and the mint was trying to keep everyday commerce supplied. That means every 1967 dime is connected to a very specific moment in American monetary history. Perhaps that is why these coins feel different when you hold them. They are not just old enough to be collectible, they belong to a turning point. Think of someone receiving this dime in 1967. Perhaps they were buying groceries for their family. Perhaps they slipped it into a pocket while heading to work. Maybe a child found it on the sidewalk and proudly carried it home. Nobody knew that 50 or 60 years later, collectors would still be studying those same coins under magnification. Nobody knew which examples would survive in remarkable condition. Nobody knew which would be lost forever. And that is the strange journey of a coin. It begins as ordinary money and can eventually become a historical artifact. But there is one detail you should check before you put a 1967 dime back into the drawer, and it is perhaps the simplest clue of all. Look at the date, then look beside it. If you do not see a mint mark, do not immediately assume something is missing. For 1967, the absence of a mint mark is normal. That tiny lesson can save a new collector from making a very common mistake. Then move on to the condition. Is the coin heavily worn? Is it bright because it has been cleaned? Are the fields covered in contact marks? Are the details sharp? Does the edge look normal? Is the weight consistent with the expected specification? And most importantly, is there anything that appears genuinely mint-made rather than damaged after circulation? If you think you have found something unusual, photograph it, preserve it, and seek expert advice before making any claim about its value. The coin does not need a fantasy price to have a fascinating story. It already survived a remarkable period in American history. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson from our 3 Roosevelt dimes. The 1973 D showed us why the D mint mark and condition matter. The 1970 D reminded us that a dramatic claim should always be compared with documented auction evidence. And now the 1967 dime has taken us into an era of coin shortages, changing metals, and suspended mint marks. 3 small coins, 3 different stories, all connected by one remarkable American tradition, the habit of saving something that once seemed too ordinary to matter. So if you have old Roosevelt dimes sitting in a jar, an envelope, or a family collection, take a moment before you spend them. You may not find a $63 million fortune, and you should never assume that you have. But you might discover a beautifully preserved survivor, an interesting variety, or a genuine mint error worthy of professional attention. And even if you find nothing unusual, you are still holding a piece of history that passed through American hands more than half a century ago. That is what makes coin collecting so rewarding. The value may be measured in dollars, but the story is measured in memories. So tonight, when you look through that old collection again, slow down. Turn each coin over. Check the dates. Study the surfaces. Ask questions. Because sometimes, the most important discovery is not the number printed on a price guide. It is realizing that the little coin you almost ignored has been quietly carrying a piece of America's past all along.